Welcome to your lecture on the letter to the Galatians. You might have some more questions about the Apostle Paul from the last lecture, and that is completely okay. Just make sure you send me any kind of emails with any kind of questions that you have. We're going to look at the letter of Galatians now and pay real close attention to the beginning of it for sure, to some of the background that Paul gives us for the reasons why he's writing this letter. And then I'll let you really come through the last sections of Galatians to get a better idea of what the whole letter's about. Galatians is one of those undisputed epistles of Paul and probably one of the earliest. Galatians, 1 Thessalonians, and the Epistle of James is probably the three earliest letters that are written in the New Testament. That's if you believe that James was written early. And I do, as you can hear in all my video lectures. But Paul wrote Galatians early, probably in the late 40s to the mid 50s. Some scholars really argue for the late 40s, others mid 50s. I think it could be within any of that window. So Galatians is written early and is dealing with an early issue. The primary issue in the letter of Galatians is circumcision. And that's no small issue in early Christianity because the movement, the Jesus movement, is moving towards Gentiles, and Paul is the one who's really making that happen. So the question that Galatians addresses, and a major issue, a crisis even in early Christianity or the early Jesus movement was, what do you do about Gentiles who say they believe in Jesus Christ or have the faith of Jesus Christ, and yet they're not Jewish? Is that enough? Or do they have to become Jewish because the Jesus movement is a Jewish movement? To be a follower of Jesus, then you have to be Jewish, which means you have to follow all the law. And one of the main identity markers in this early Jewish movement, the early Jesus movement, was circumcision. It was a defining mark of Judaism in the Greco-Roman world. And we may not think that circumcision is a big deal now, mainly because it's a pretty pervasive cultural thing to do in North America and in other parts of the world. But in the Greco-Roman period, this was not something everybody did. And in fact, the gymnasium, which was in every major city in the Greco-Roman world, that's where men, because only men were citizens, and they are only free-born men could be citizens of the Roman Empire or citizens of the local city. And so they would go to this gymnasium and go to the gym just like we do today. But when they went into the gym in the Greco-Roman world, they would be completely naked. And they would compete naked. So they would run, they would wrestle, they would do other kind of sports, totally nude. So when men would go into the gymnasium and compete or exercise, it was obvious who the Jews were because they were circumcised. And this became a big joke among Greeks and Romans against Jews. So circumcision is a major issue because it is an identity marker of Judaism, and one that a lot of Jews were very adamant about. And to this day, it continues to be a marker of Judaism. But in the Greco-Roman period, it wasn't a private enterprise. And so for Gentiles to convert to Judaism, they had to be circumcised, which means this would be on public display in the gymnasium. And so when Paul says that no, Gentiles don't have to be circumcised, the Jews who believed in Jesus would have not been able to comprehend what he was talking about. So Paul obviously preached a gospel that said that Gentiles did not have to be circumcised in order to enter into covenant with God. They entered into covenant with God through Jesus Christ. This would have been radical even for Jesus-believing Jews, because most of them would have not understood Jesus outside of the Torah. He was the Jewish Messiah sent to Jews to free Jews from outside oppression. So to understand Jesus as a way to get around the law would have been incomprehensible. But this became a major issue in early Christianity. And Paul, there in Galatians, so I'm going to look down reading the Bible to you to kind of read Galatians and hear what it says. Paul calls this his opponents who have won over the believers in Galatia to their way. Their way was a very Jewish way. It was you have to follow the law, you have to be circumcised, and that's what, in fact, is a part of Christianity. It's how you believe, because it was a Jewish movement. Paul calls this a different gospel in Galatians, and I think in verse 7, Galatians chapter 1, verse 7, he goes, not that there is another gospel. Verse 6, I'll back up. He goes, I'm astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. So Paul, and then he says, it's not even, there's no such thing as a different gospel. It's a false gospel, if you will. So it begs the question is like, how do Gentiles enter into the covenant then? Do they have to obey identity markers for Jewish self-understanding, or do Gentiles have another way? And Paul says that they absolutely, their way is through Jesus Christ. I will say that nowhere does Paul argue that Jews are free from the law. This is a big issue in New Testament, among New Testament scholars. Does Paul also say that Jews don't have to follow the law? That's never clear, but it is very clear that Paul understands that Gentiles do not have to be circumcised. So he calls it a different gospel. And circumcision is the main thing. Now, chapter 1, verses 10 through 24, and then chapter 2, 1 through 10, Paul narrates his experience when he has this revelation of Christ that utterly transforms him and changes the way he thinks about Jesus, changes the way he understands how Gentiles are included. That revelation changed everything for Paul. And that revelation was based on Jesus' death and resurrection. For Paul, everything is filtered through Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. And he talks more about crucifixion than resurrection. But in these encounters with these leaders, he names James in particular. And it looks like he and James never really see eye to eye. He says, I went to lay my gospel before them so that I made sure I didn't run in vain. Now, he also calls them so-called leaders. So he's basically saying he didn't care who the supposed leaders are, because his gospel came directly from God. Now, this is a big issue, because who's in charge in early Christianity? Is it James in Jerusalem, or is it anybody like Paul who could get a revelation from God? Who had the authority to say what the gospel was? This is a big issue, and they're figuring out as they go. And this is one of the reasons Paul writes the letter to the Galatians, to kind of figure this stuff out. Paul apparently was in Galatia. He started a lot of these churches and then preached this gospel. And then people from Jerusalem, probably from James. In the letter itself, it says that men from James came to Antioch, which isn't far from the Galatia region. And when men from James came, Peter kind of recoiled a little bit and became a lot more Jewish, a lot more of who he originally was. And this infuriated Paul. So Paul pushed back against Peter there in chapter 2, 11 through, I think, verse 14. Let me just check. Yeah, verse 14. So throughout, Paul is engaging with major leaders in the early Jesus movement in Jerusalem around what constitutes the good news of Jesus Christ. And he says that the leaders in Jerusalem told him that he was doing everything he was supposed to, only to remember the poor. He says that in chapter 2, verse 10. They asked only one thing, that we remember the poor, which was actually what I was eager to do. Now, in the book of Acts, the book of Acts narrates this a little bit different. I should have had it. It should have been already there. But in Acts chapter 15, Luke retells this story. And there, after Paul lays out his gospel to these leaders, after they heard everything he said, this is what James says according to Luke in Acts. James says, and this is chapter 15, verse 19 and following. Therefore, I have reached the decision that we should not trouble those Gentiles who are turning to God, but we should write to them to abstain only from things polluted by idols, from fornication, and from whatever has been strangled, and from blood. For in every city for generations past, Moses has had those who proclaim him, for he has been read aloud every Sabbath in the synagogues. So there, according to Acts, James at least gives 4 qualifications that Gentiles are, they don't have to be circumcised, but they have to do these 4 things. Paul says they say nothing, only remember the poor. In the letter of James, it's pretty clear that James wants the receivers of that letter to obey everything in the law. That's in James chapter 2, verses 1 through 13. He's very adamant about all of the law has to be followed. And there he uses some examples of the 10 Commandments. If you commit adultery but do not murder, you've actually broken all the laws because you've committed adultery. So he basically says that if you break one law, you break all the law. That's how important the law is to James. And here Paul is saying, listen, you don't have to be circumcised to be a follower of Jesus. And this is utterly radical. So what is it about Paul that, in Paul's experience with the living Christ, that really changes him? We don't fully know, but this idea that Gentiles are law-free from certain aspects of the law is indicative to who Paul is and the gospel that he preaches. And so in chapter 3, verse 28, he kind of culminates in this argument where he goes, there is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male and female, for all are one in Christ Jesus. And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise. So this is utterly contradictory to the Jewish Christians' understanding of how Gentiles get incorporated into the Jesus movement. It is a major issue in early Christianity, and most of Galatians deals with it. So as Paul gets into this argument there in chapter 3, verse 1 and following, go and read this passage. You need to read all of Galatians anyway, but pay a close attention to Paul's argument in chapter 3, 1 and following, because he basically says Gentiles don't have to follow the law. And he uses Abraham as an example of why faith alone saves people. That terminology is very important to Paul. And what's fascinating about it is that James, in chapter 2, verses 14 through 26 of the letter of James, James says, you aren't saved by faith alone. With faith without works is dead. And then James uses Abraham as an example of how works is an important part of the Jesus followers. So here you can clearly see that James and Paul completely disagree with each other because they're making opposite arguments. James is saying you have to have works. Paul is saying you don't have to have works. It's faith only. James says it's not faith alone. And then both of them use Abraham as a way to show that that's exactly what their argument's about. So they use Abraham as a scriptural reference to support their argument, and their argument is directly opposed to each other. So that's the reason why Paul wrote Galatians. It is the meanest letter he writes. He is angry from the first verse to the last. There's no, in all of his letters, he's always, he says, I, Paul, write this letter, and then he gives his thanksgiving section at the very beginning of his letters where he's all thankful to God for that. There is no thanksgiving area in the letter of Galatians. He never says, I thank God for every remembrance of you, like he does in Philippians. He actually says in chapter 3, verse 1, you foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? At the very first chapter 1, verse 6, he says, I'm astonished that you're so quickly deserting the one who called you. So he's pretty angry with the Galatian churches, and he's laying it all on the line. But this argument about faith and works, it is a crisis in the early Jesus movement, and has everything to do with the incorporation of Gentiles. It becomes so important that one of Paul's last letters, and his longest and probably most important, is his letter to the Romans. He brings this section back up again in Romans and spends a couple of chapters writing about it there and using Abraham again as an example of how faith is how the Gentiles are saved or incorporated into the Jesus movement. So that's Galatians. Keep reading it. Read it over against James this week. And then a lot of this stuff you'll find on your weekly quizzes. Thank you.